Not Mr. PowerPoint, although he's certainly done them. Okay, everybody, we're live. Just so you know, between Kedron, Paul, Dan, and I, we're ironing out at least one, maybe two technical details. Sorry about that, folks. You know how it goes, though, right?
Yep.
So bear with us. Dan is our main teacher today. Dan Conder. I guess I'll introduce him. He's a friend of 15 years, Kedron? Probably, maybe more. Kedron, Dan, myself, Foster Stanback, and a couple others, Ryan Colon and Vet Nguyen. We've been part of an organization called Apologetics Research Society for well over 15 years. We put on many conferences. And in our group, Dan is kind of the apologetics wonk of all of us. I would say all of us are pretty good at apologetics, but Dan is sort of the man. I can't tell you the number of classes I taught where Dan was in the front row, and I would ask him, did I get it right? And if Dan says I got it right, that means it's right. So this is Dan. A lot of you know me. Probably not many of you know Dan, but you're going to know him after this class. Anyway, I'm just shooting the breeze because Dan is now here. That's great.
Yeah.
And Dan, do you have a PowerPoint presentation?
I do.
Okay, so that's what we're going to do. That's going to be tricky. So you're going to, you see the laptop picture on the top, kind of just to the left of the middle?
Yes. Yes, we see it.
You're going to have to click on that.
Yes.
And then when that comes in, there'll be a picture of, I don't know, a laptop, and you have to click on that. All right, and then you have to start your PowerPoint. So in other words, clicking on that computer, that's the equivalent of share screen. Got it? Got it? Dan?
No, we're trying to.
Putting it together here.
All right. You click on that computer thing. That's the equivalent of a shared screen in Zoom. But then you have to click on the little screen that comes on and then start your PowerPoint. All right, Paul?
Yeah.
Entire screen?
Yes.
Okay.
And then it'll kind of go zoom, like, taking a picture of a picture of a picture of a picture.
Okay.
And then just start your PowerPoint.
And start my PowerPoint and like this. Do you see that?
No.
No.
When you click on turn screen share on, that should highlight blue.
Anyway, class, if you came in a little bit later, like I said, you guys keep talking to each other, Dan and Paul. But those came in later. We're having a technical difficulty with PowerPoint. We'll start in a minute, but bear with us. Hopefully in 3 or 4 minutes, we'll start the class.
Yeah.
What is it doing when you're, because you guys are staring, there you go. Okay.
There you go.
Okay.
Now
we're in the infinity of
there
mirror.
You go.
Okay.
Perfect.
Kedron and John, you can turn off your videos.
Okay. Anyway, class, welcome to Dan, and take it away, Dan.
Thank you. John gave me a great introduction there. It makes me sound much better than I am because I have the enviable role of letting John present and pull out all this information after information after information. And then I just get to kind of sit back and, take it all in and occasionally throw something in. It sounds like, I really know what I'm talking about. But grateful to have everyone here. Sorry for the delay. I'm grateful for the Lighthouse Church of Christ, which is kind of hosting me here, and Raymond Ramos, who leads the Singles Impact Ministry of the Lighthouse Church of Christ, is kind of my tech support here, my moral support. He's physically distant. I'm emotionally distant. So, we're complying with everything that's needed. But we opened last week, John started us out looking at some of the hard questions of the Bible, some of the most challenging topics. And John mentioned some of the toughest topics are these big theological concepts, and I would agree with that. And he tackled a lot of those last week. Kedron is going to be looking at decision-making in the will of God next week. That's another big one. And I'm going to be looking at some smaller things, alleged contradictions in the Bible, and specifically logical contradictions. So I'm not going to be looking at things external to the scriptures. Some people talk about the Bible contradicting ancient history, that Josephus says one thing and the Bible says another thing, that it doesn't match other things in the ancient Near East or the Greco-Roman world. Those are important apologetical questions, but in our time we have together today, I'm not going to be really looking at those. Sometimes people talk about contradictions between the Bible and modern science. You know, the Bible says one thing and our modern scientific theories say something else. Also important apologetics questions, but I'm not going to really be looking at those today. If you're curious about those, there's this website called evidenceforchristianity.org that maybe you've heard of that addresses some of these. But I will be looking specifically at logical contradictions, which that's a very specific thing. And so that's what I will be focused on. And you'll have people, friends come up to you and say, you can't trust the Bible. It's full of hundreds of logical contradictions. I think it's important for us to really engage them at that point and just ask some questions, really clarify what do they mean when they say you can't trust the Bible, it's full of logical contradictions. Where are they coming from with that? And then I would want examples of, you know, what's a contradiction? What are you talking about? But they could be coming from a lot of different places. People could be just saying, the Bible's confusing. I find it really confusing. In which case, like Philip, the evangelist with the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8, I think we should come alongside them and explain what the scriptures are teaching. And so it's not confusing to them. They might mean it's confusing. They might mean, well, the Bible says one thing in one place, it says another thing in another place, and I can't make sense of it. I don't know what to believe or what to obey. You know, God is telling me, don't eat pork, and then God says it's okay to eat pork. You know, what am I supposed to do with these, contradictory guidelines? I mean, I'm paralyzed here. It's full of contradictions. Which, in the same way, I think, as Philip did, we just explain the scriptures to them, and it's no contradiction if God, at one period of time, makes one covenant with a particular group of people, and some of the terms and conditions of that covenant include some dietary guidelines. Then at another point in time, the same God can make a new covenant with a larger group of people, and the terms and conditions don't include those same dietary guidelines. It's different things. It's not a contradiction. But they might mean something much deeper, and they might mean it intentionally or unintentionally. They might mean it at kind of a gut level, or they might mean it at a more sophisticated, more philosophical level, that the Bible can't be trusted, it can't be true, because it has logical contradictions in it. Because intuitively we know that logically contradictory things cannot be true. And so if we have the scriptures contradicting each other, then we have a problem with the truthfulness of God's word. And that's what is really being attacked when the claim is made, there's logical contradictions in the Bible. And people may not realize that's what they're saying, but deep down, that is kind of the issue we have with logically contradictory things being in the Bible or anywhere else in life. For example, if I were to talk about, say, for example, Kedron Jones and I are brothers. That is the case. It's also the case that Kedron Jones and I are not brothers. Now, hearing that, we already think, okay, is this a joke? What's the deal here? You can't say both of those things in the same time, and you're expecting me to kind of reconcile those somehow. So I think Christians know where I'm going, that Kedron Jones and I are brothers in Christ. And so I can affirm that as true, and at the same time affirm as true that Kedron Jones and I are not brothers biologically. Although we've both taken DNA tests, there's going to be a big reveal at the end of this webinar. We haven't seen the results yet, so maybe, somewhere back there, we could be related somehow. So stay tuned for that. That's really going to be an important moment. But no, seriously, you can see how Kedron Jones and I would not be biological brothers, but we could be brothers in Christ at the same time and in the same sense, but in different senses. But that wasn't always true. We weren't always Christians, so there was a time when that wasn't true. And so I would present the principle of non-contradiction, this basic law of logic, as something cannot be both A and not A at the same time and in the same sense. Something cannot be A and non-A at the same time and in the same sense or in the same way. And the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy puts it as, it is impossible that the same thing cannot at the same time both belong and not belong to the same object in the same respect. This is a rule of reality. This is a rule of thought. We can't really think coherently without this being in play. And so that's what we mean by a logical contradiction. It's a very specific thing. And I think that's one of the key takeaways here, is not everything that is confusing or unclear really meets this level of being an actual logical contradiction. Here's an example your skeptical friend might bring up. How many blind men did Jesus heal near Jericho? Luke 18:35 through 38, as Jesus drew near Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the road begging. Hearing a crowd passing by, he inquired what this meant. Jesus the Nazarene is passing by, they told him. And Jesus goes on to heal that man. Matthew 20:30, there were two blind men sitting by the road. When they heard that Jesus was passing by, they cried out, "Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David." And Jesus goes on to heal those two blind men. So here we have two scriptures. Did he heal one blind man or two blind men? Is this a logical impossibility? Well, there's an Anglican Bible scholar, John Wenham, who wrote a number of great works. He wrote a book called The Easter Enigma that talks about Easter and reconciling all the gospel accounts of the crucifixion and the resurrection. John Wenham, not just a Bible scholar, but also a good grasp of basic mathematics, noted that, quote, whenever there are two, there's always one. And yeah, that really holds to be the case. So you have Luke mentioning a blind man, and it would be an argument from silence to say that that excludes another blind man being there. So you could have two, and Luke just doesn't mention one. That's a possibility. To say otherwise would be an argument from silence that Christian apologist Dr. Jason Lyle calls the subset fallacy, where you've got a big number and then there's a smaller number that's a subset of it, and they're not necessarily contradictory. But there's other possibilities. How many blind people did Jesus heal in the course of his ministry? We don't know. He healed a lot of blind people on a lot of different occasions. How many times did Jesus visit Jericho? We're assuming this was the same visit. It might not have been. So this may not be in the same time. And so a lot of this comes down to the assumptions we bring to the text. And a surface reading might lead you to think it's a logical contradiction. We look a little closer, it isn't necessary. And a logical contradiction basically means it's logically impossible for both those things to be true at the same time and in the same sense. It's logically impossible. There's no way to resolve it. There's no way it could be true. But if you can show by some way that it is logically possible, maybe not probable, not likely necessarily, but as long as there's a logical possibility, then it's possible. It's not contradictory. Another example that is brought up, I think as Christians, we read over these passages. We don't really register this as a contradiction, but you find this in a lot of lists of alleged Bible contradictions. How did the men crucified with Jesus treat Jesus? Mark 15:32, let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross so that we may see and believe. Even those who were crucified with him were taunting him. So these two men being crucified with Jesus are mocking Jesus. Luke 23, verses 39 to 40. Then one of the criminals hanging there began to yell insults at him. Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us. But the other answered, rebuking him, don't you even fear God, since you are undergoing the same punishment? And Jesus goes on to forgive this man and offer him a place in paradise, a famous passage, an encouraging passage. But this is sometimes thrown out as a contradiction. Both mocked him, or only one mocked him, and the other one stood up for Jesus. Well, I think Christians, as I said, we usually read over this. We just take it for granted. They were on the cross for several hours, so you could have two of the criminals, both of them mocking Jesus, and then one has a change of heart. One repents over the course of time, and Jesus forgives him. He ends the story right with God. And so people's hearts can change. And we've seen that in our own lives. We've seen that in the lives of people around us. And we see this, I believe, in these two passages. And this gives us some clues to other passages. You see passages in the Bible, in the Old Testament, where there are kings that start out really good and then fall away from God and end their lives apart from God. Then you have kings, far too many in the Old Testament, that start out very wicked, but then they repent. They kind of turn their lives around. And so these aren't contradictory things. You see over the course of time, people can change one way or the other. And I think we see in the scriptures where, to our surprise, you have very wicked men and women that sometimes say and do some good things. And somewhat disturbingly, we find a lot of righteous men and women in the Bible that say and do some pretty bad things. But our spiritual journey is has full of these peak experiences, these mountaintops, and it's full of what some have called the agony of faith, the valleys. And you see someone like Abraham, that is, the father of faith, and yet you see times when he's struggling in his faith. And so over time, you see different things. It's not really a contradiction. And so not only is this not a contradiction, it gives us an idea how other similar contradictions, alleged contradictions, might be resolved. In the same way that we look at how many blind men were healed, that we can abstract to other things in the scriptures. How many angels were at the tomb? Was it one angel? Was it two angels? Well, it kind of depends on who is coming there and what time they're coming there. And then, of course, where there's two angels, there was one angel. So some of these principles apply. Here's a question. Does everyone sin? I've talked about sin a little bit here with righteous people and wicked people. Romans 3:23, I think we're all pretty familiar with. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But in 1 Peter 2:21 and 22, it says, for you were all called to this because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you should follow in his steps. He did not commit sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. So everyone sins? Jesus didn't. A logical contradiction? I mean, if I said we'd all sinned, I think Christians would agree with that. If I said Jesus never sinned, I think Christians would all agree with that. If I said everyone sinned except Jesus, I think we would all agree with that. Because intuitively, we kind of know what I'm saying when I say that. But at times, we're looking at the Bible as if it's making some kind of universal, absolute statement, and anything different from that is a contradiction to that statement. But I don't think that's what's going on here. Romans 3:23 is giving us a general truth. It's a generalization. It's not an absolute. Adam and Eve didn't have any sin until, of course, they did sin. But so there's no contradiction in human beings being without sin. We know that they were. We know very clearly from Scripture that Jesus never sinned. So the Bible is giving us a general rule, but then it also gives the rare exceptions to the rule. Jesus being the obvious exception here, and because Jesus did not sin, there's hope for the rest of us who have sinned. Here's another example. Does everyone die? Seems pretty clear. We mentioned it last week, Hebrews 9:27 and 28. Just as it is appointed for people to die once, and after this judgment, so also the Messiah, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him. Hebrews 11:5, just a few chapters later. By faith, Enoch was taken away so he not experienced death. And he was not to be found because God took him away. For prior to his removal, he was approved, since he had pleased God. So everyone dies. Enoch did not die. A logical contradiction? Well, I think this is another example of what I'm talking about here. These aren't absolute statements that the Bible is making. It's often making generalizations, and it's free to clarify those generalizations. I don't think the writer of Hebrews forgot what he wrote a few chapters earlier. In fact, later in chapter 11, he talks about all these people, including Enoch in the Hall of Fame of Faith, and says, these all died before they received what was promised. Well, he just said a few verses earlier that Enoch did not die a natural death. So that's an obvious exception. So I think when we read the scriptures, there's some level confusion sometimes, as philosopher David Stove would put it, where we're taking a general statement and we're seeing that as an absolute, universal, no exceptions, when God is just making a general truth, and there are some rare exceptions. And I'm sure you recall as well that we also have the prophet Elijah in the Old Testament, who does not die a natural death. He seems to be bodily assumed into the heavenly realms in some way. But so you have a few rare exceptions, but still everyone dies. And you have some rare exceptions to that, but not a logical contradiction. And this, I think we see this in a few separate passages, but also I'm probably like a lot of us, I'm in on a Bible reading plan. I'm going through trying to go through the Bible once in a year. And you see this all the time in scriptures. And if you're watching for it, and I know I'm noticing this as I'm reading through the Bible. Here's another example. Genesis 6:5-8. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth and the human race I have created with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So here you have every man, woman, and child on earth was thinking about evil every minute of every day, but not Noah. So God is making this general judgment on the state of humanity at that point in time. It's a pretty dark time, but this shouldn't be absolutized. And this is often used as a proof text of total human depravity and by some theological schools. But we would never absolutize verse 8, that Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord, therefore Noah was pure and sinless and never did any. We know Noah was a sinner, but he's a righteous man. So God is just painting the background here of how wicked this generation was in somewhat hyperbolic way. He's making that general statement, and then he's clarifying it with, there was a righteous man that found favor in the eyes of God in that generation. Now, granted, with that generation being as wicked as it was, maybe the bar wasn't that high for Noah to be considered a righteous man, but still considered a righteous man. And so the Bible's giving this general statement, giving us the background, but giving some clarification. Here is a righteous man that God could use. Here's another example, 1 Kings 15:5. Because David did what was right in the sight of the Lord and had not turned aside from anything that God commanded him all the days of his life, except in the case of Uriah the Hittite. So here we're affirming that David was a righteous man, but admitting he fell tragically short. This was devastating to David, to his family, to the kingdom. And so the Bible is giving us the good, the bad, and the ugly, of these people, where it doesn't deny, the wrongdoing. It doesn't deny when someone was right. It's just, that's just clarifying kind of the general statements that's being made. So it's not contradictory, although a surface reading could give you that impression. But this is just talking about we shouldn't overlook the good that people have done, but we shouldn't overlook the bad either. We should keep it all in balance. Here's another deep question. Does God exist? Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God does not exist. Psalm 14:1. God exists. God doesn't exist. Well, that's pretty dark. I don't know what we're supposed to believe here. It says one thing, it says the opposite. I'm starting to kind of waver here in my, wait a minute. It kind of depends who is saying what's said in the scriptures. The Bible is true in whatever it affirms as true. I mean, the Bible records things that Satan said. It's not affirming those as true. The Bible is a faithful record of things that happened, but you have to consider the source. I mean, the Bible kind of gives us the source, for some of these things that are said. So you have to look who's talking. I hope I've revived John Travolta's career with that little reference. I found this meme online, Luke 4:7. You find that in your encouragement calendar. If thou therefore wilt worship me, all shall be thine. So that's an encouraging thing to hear from God. But these are actually the words of Satan to Jesus, tempting Jesus in the wilderness. You kind of have to look who's talking. It depends who's saying what. And you have a number of passages in the book of Job. Job has his different friends, and they're arguing different things. And then at the end of the book, God says, these guys were all wrong. So you can't be pulling passages out of the book of Job and assume, hey, this is something the Bible's teaching. The Bible is a faithful record of, what Satan says there in the book of Job, what Job's comforters say and all their different opinions. And then at the end of the book, you have what God says, where he says, these guys all had it wrong. So we have to really get the perspective of who's saying what. In the Old Testament, we have the death of Saul, and we've got some discrepancies in the accounts. But the Bible is a faithful record of here's how King Saul died, and it also says here's a faithful record of what an Amalekite said about how King Saul died. So if there's some differences, it could be this rather self-serving account from this Amalekite might not be the full truth of the situation. You have Jesus in the New Testament. There's different things in the gospel with the synagogue ruler Jairus and his daughter. And was she dead? When did she die? Was she close to death? But we have Luke giving an account of it. And then we have another gospel, I believe Matthew, where it's talking about someone reporting to Jairus, hey, she's already dead. Don't bother the teacher anymore. So the Bible is reporting other people reporting things. It's not necessarily saying that what they said was accurate. And so those really aren't going to work as logical contradictions. I thought you said James was dead. Acts 12, 1-2. About that time, King Herod cruelly attacked some who belonged to the church, and he killed James, John's brother, with the sword. Then the whole assembly fell silent and listened to Barnabas and Paul describe all the signs and wonders God had done through them among the Gentiles. After they stopped speaking, James responded, brothers, listen to me. That's Acts 15, 12-14. So James is killed. Then a couple chapters later, James speaks up. Well, I think we know, and there's even a clue there in Acts 12. This is James, the son of Zebedee, the brother of John, son of Zebedee, one of the 12 apostles. And it's James the Just, the half-brother of Jesus, author of the book of James. He is the James that's speaking in Acts 15. You have a lot of people in the Bible with the same name. And so we can't assume that it's always talking about the person we think it is. There's a lot of Marys running around in the Gospels. And so how many angels did Mary see at the tomb? We have to figure out which Mary we're talking about and which visit to the tomb we're talking about. That really has to be nailed down. In the 12 apostles, you've got two guys named Simon or Simeon. You've got two guys named James. You've got two guys named Judas. So you have to figure out what person, we're talking about when we're in the scriptures, because you have a lot of different people with the same name, and then you have a lot of individuals with multiple names. Simon Peter is he's Simon or Simeon. He's Petros or Peter. He's Cephas. He's called a number of different names. You have a case in 2 Kings 15 where it's talking about Judah's king Azariah, and then it gives a parallel account in 2 Chronicles 26 talking about Judah's king Azariah, or I think it's Uzziah in that passage. But Uzziah and Azariah, they're just variants of the same name. And then you have an Old Testament figure like King Jedediah. Now that may not be the most familiar name. He's one of the great kings of Israel, one of the greatest kings of Israel. In 2 Samuel 12, verses 24 to 26, it talks about King Jedediah. But we know him better as King Solomon. That is the one time in the Bible that he's called Jedediah. He's never called Jedediah by anyone after that. Then we have a New Testament figure like Joseph the Levite, one of the great Christian leaders in the early church. But we don't really know him as Joseph the Levite, this guy from Cyprus. We know him better by his nickname, Barnabas. And that's how he is known throughout the New Testament. He's only identified as Joseph in this one passage in Acts. But there were a lot of guys named Joseph running around. So it was helpful to have a nickname like Barnabas to kind of identify who he is. And so when we're not sure who they're referring to, we shouldn't rush to assume there's a contradiction. If we're not sure in Matthew 23, when Jesus speaks about Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, who was killed, we shouldn't assume that was the prophet Zechariah. There's a lot of Zechariahs in the Bible, and Zechariah is not mentioned in the Bible. So before we assume, we should make sure we've got we're talking about the exact same person. And so that resolves a lot of alleged logical contradictions. How did Sisera die? This is this Old Testament leader against Israel in Judges 4:21. While he was sleeping from exhaustion, Heber's wife Yael took a tent peg, grabbed a hammer, and went silently to Sisera. She hammered the peg into his temple and drove it into the ground, and he died. I know what you're thinking. He shouldn't have ordered the stake. Judges 5, the next chapter, Judges 5:26 to 29. She reached for her tent peg, her right hand for a workman's mallet. Then she hammered Sisera. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his temple. He collapsed. He fell. He lay down at her feet. He collapsed. He fell at her feet where he collapsed. There he fell, dead. So how did Sisera die? Was he asleep, lying on the ground, fast asleep, and is then killed? He seems to be, in the other passage, just the very next chapter, he's staggering around. He seems to be standing, staggering, falling, collapsing, a little repetitive. So how did Sisera really die? I guess we could look at the logical possibility. He woke up, staggered around before he died. But I would like to point out that in chapter 4, this is giving a kind of straightforward account of what happened. And what I'm quoting from chapter 5, this is from the Song of Deborah. This was a song of victory that she and Barak are singing after the battle. And so that could account for the differences here. The Bible is communicating truth, but in different ways. And the philosopher Mortimer Adler made the distinction between propositional truth and poetical truth. I mean, they're both ways of communicating truth. But propositional truth, this is it's on a spectrum, and Propositional truth is at the more literal end of the spectrum. It's communicating truth in propositions, which are just declarative statements, just simple statements of fact. And that's what we really have here in Judges 4. Whereas in Judges 5, we have a song. It's also communicating truth, but it's doing it poetically. It's more figurative. It's not as it's making the same points, but in a more colorful way. And we see this oftentimes in the scriptures, where we get kind of a more propositional account, and then you might have that same event, like the exit from Egypt, or the creation talked about in Genesis. You'll have those events reflected on in the Psalms. But the Psalms will be looking back at these events in the life of Israel in a more poetic way. The Psalms are poetic. These are psalms and prayers. Often in the prophetic books, God's communicating to his prophets in dreams and visions, very poetically. And the prophets are often preaching somewhat poetically, somewhat figuratively. They're talking about the spiritual significance of things that are happening. And they're not giving a dry play-by-play news report necessarily on what's happening. And so we always have to look at where is the account that we're reading on the spectrum, and things that might superficially look like logical contradictions. It's actually the same incident being related in a slightly different way. And so that needs to be kept in mind. For example, what did Judas, when he betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, what did Judas get for his 30 pieces of silver? I could say Judas got what was coming to him. That would be a more poetical way of saying it. What did Judas get for his money? A grave. Or I could give a more propositional account, and this is what the Gospel of Matthew does, where it talks about Judas felt remorse. He threw the money back into the temple. The Jewish leadership said, this is blood money. We can't have this here at the temple. It can't be part of the treasury. We don't want it back. And so they buy a burial plot, and this is where Judas will eventually be buried. That's the propositional, blow-by-blow account of it. Whereas Luke in Acts chapter 1 is giving a more poetical account of it. This is what he got with his money. He got a place to be buried. So that clarifies a lot of potential alleged contradictions when we look at the Bible's communicating truth in a number of different ways. Now, finally, we're getting back to these blind men near Jericho. What happened near Jericho? Mark 10, verse 46, for example, they came to Jericho, and as Jesus was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a large crowd, Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the road. Luke 18:35, as Jesus drew near Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the road begging. Luke 19, 1 and 2. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. There was a man named Zacchaeus who was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. So was Jesus leaving Jericho, or was Jesus coming to Jericho? Well, we have to look and see if this is a genuine instance of a logical contradiction. Is this logically impossible? Well, as I mentioned earlier, was this the same time? How many times did Jesus visit Jericho? We don't really know. He did at least once, but we don't know how many times he went to Jericho. How many blind men did Jesus heal at Jericho? Well, at least 2 It could be more. We don't know how many blind men Jesus healed. And you could have a lot of different scenarios that are logically possible. Maybe Jesus is leaving, heals a blind, arrives, heals a blind man. He leaves, heals another blind man. There's different ways you could reconcile that. What if there were two cities of Jericho? Like, what if you had one city of Jericho and then maybe, a mile or two down the road, you've got another city of Jericho. And so when Jesus is leaving one, he's going into the other. Now that might sound a little far-fetched, a little ad hoc, a little grasping at straws to resolve the logical contradiction. I think there's a lot of ways that we could actually resolve this. And I think there's a lot of logical possibilities. But with a logical possibility, we're not talking about probability or likelihood. So the idea of two cities of Jericho side by side may not be the most probable idea, but it does resolve the logical problem. However, there were two cities of Jericho in the first century. We have the city of Jericho we're all familiar with. Joshua comes in and destroys the walled city. And it's at a strategic location. There's a lot of springs nearby. There's farmland there nearby. So it's eventually rebuilt multiple times. But by the first century, the time of Jesus, that old city of Jericho has fallen on pretty hard times. It's not a very nice place, but a mile or two away, you have a very wealthy area, also called Jericho, where a number of chief priests and a lot of the scribal elite in Jerusalem have summer homes. Herod the Great had a summer palace. In fact, he had multiple summer palaces in Jericho. And so they would travel south from Jerusalem down to Jericho and be in their vacation homes down there. So you had an old city of Jericho that's all run down, and then you have trendy, upscale Jericho estates. You have Jericho Heights. So where would a blind man most likely live? He's going to live in the slums of old Jericho and be begging for money. And as a beggar, he's probably going to want to be a little closer to the wealthy Jericho. So we see there in Luke, as Jesus is drawing near to the second Jericho, it says in chapter 19, he entered Jericho and was passing through. And who does he meet there? Zacchaeus, the tax collector, a guy that's pretty connected, has a lot of money. He's going to live in the nice Jericho. And these are about a mile or two apart. So I like that idea. I find that really interesting. It's kind of an interesting way to kind of reconcile these passages. Is it the most likely? Not necessarily. But as I said, logical possibility is just resolving the logical contradictions. It's not necessarily probability. But I enjoy this explanation, and even though it's not the most likely one, and I think it's helpful to illustrate that initially when I said two cities of Jericho side by side, it seems pretty far-fetched. It seems like a stretch. But as we fill in the gaps with a little more history, a little more archaeology, it becomes surprisingly plausible, something that initially seemed very far-fetched. And so as we throw out logical possibilities for some of these alleged contradictions, they might seem a little strange sometimes, or like we're grasping at straws trying to avoid, contradictions in the Bible. And yet, some of those unlikely explanations could have some surprising plausibility as we learn more about the ancient world. And that was my final example. I think the big takeaway that I want you to get from all of this, we've looked at a lot of little individual examples. The big takeaway is, ironically, it's the skeptic who has to have dogmatic certainty that there is a genuine logical contradiction in the Bible. It's not really the Christian. It's the burden of proof is on the skeptic to prove that this is a logical contradiction that cannot possibly be resolved. That's a pretty high burden of proof. The burden of proof isn't on the Christian to know exactly what happened, thousands of years ago, and to go scrambling around trying to figure it out. We weren't there. We don't know exactly what happened. I don't know what exactly happened with Jericho, but I've got some ideas. There's some logical possibilities, and that's all we need to provide as Christians defending the scriptures. And so the burden of proof is really on the skeptic. They've got to make a very definitive claim here, really stick. And I will leave us there. And I know we'll go on to kind of our discussion time and open it up for Q&A. And I think Paul has a video for us as well that we'll probably see. But I'll end right there.
Am I on?
You are. You are on.
I love that last example, Dan, because you had us all totally thinking you're being an idiot here. Around, you made us feel like we were being so judgmental. That was a great one.
Yep. And I think because you might have the administrative rights, Dan. I think. Oh, there we go. Okay. And so you have to Mac.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I originally heard that on Jericho from Dr. Craig Blomberg, who's one of the top gospel scholars in the English-speaking world, and he wrote a book on historical reliability of the Gospels. And so I was taking a class from him, and he introduced this whole Jericho thing, and I was like, I've never heard that before. That's apparently A.T. Robertson back in the 1930s mentions that in one of his books. But it's, I don't know that that's the most likely explanation, but I do find that one very interesting to kind of go through all the logistics of,
Right, I think your point there, Dan, was what we're doing is, it's like you said, burden of proof. It's like if you're trying to prove somebody lied, I don't have to prove that I didn't lie. You know what I'm saying? You have to prove that. And so I think that's what we're talking about. It's still true today. It is still true today that you can be in Jericho and get on a bus and take a 5-minute drive to Jericho. It's still true even today.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yes.
Wow. And Dan, I think you've, like always, you were really thorough with everything and did a great job. And so, what do you feel like maybe in your experience has been maybe some difficulties for a lot of brothers and sisters in Christ, or maybe a lot of things that you feel like are a big issue with disciples or unbelievers who kind of come to Christians with questions?
Yeah, a lot of these that you hear and find on websites, they're a little nitpicky. They're just trying to find with the scriptures. But I think the most troubling ones are some of the moral questions where you see good men and women in the Bible, the ones that are held up as heroes, and they seem to have done, some pretty unsavory things, or where God himself seems to have done things that don't strike as fair or right. I think John dealt with those.
Oh, is Kedron back?
Here we go. Sorry, I lost you guys there. Were you able to answer my question?
I think so. I was trying to reply to it. I don't know if it got through. If
maybe you can do it one more time, just for anyone who missed it.
By the way, in our question and answer, a lot of it's going to be just more possible contradictions, and the list is infinite. There's a book called "All the Contradictions in the Bible." I don't know if you've ever read that one, Dan.
Which author?
It's Haley's Bible Handbook. That guy. This is an old book.
Oh yeah,
so,
yeah.
We did Haley's Bible Handbook. Did this book, "All the Contradictions in the Bible," which is an ironic title,
Yeah, I believe it's this one.
All right, that's another one.
This is that book.
I told, for the audience, I told you. Every time you tell Dan something, he already knew it. I'm telling you, I'm not lying.
Yeah, there's a lot of other good books too, like Gleason Archer's Handbook of Difficulties, and then Norman Geisler has a really good book as well on that issue too.
Yeah,
I've got a contradiction, Dan, that is an actual contradiction. I want you to explain it. It's,
okay.
In 2 Samuel 8:4, it says Daniel took 700 horsemen. And in 1 Chronicles 18:4, it says he took 7,000 horsemen.
Oh, that's really easy. It's right here on. Yeah, there's.
I'm doing that on purpose because there's a category of, in quotes, contradictions that you didn't mention.
Right.
So, as fun, just to see if I can get you.
Yeah.
Can you explain that one? I know the proper explanation, I believe, but I want to challenge you to see your ability, your chops as a apologist. Can you explain that one?
Yeah, that's an example, as you say, of there's a number of them like that, especially in the Old Testament. And so my question would be, how many fingers am I holding up?
4.
Is it 5 fingers or 4 fingers and a thumb? I mean, it's the same number of digits, but it depends kind of how you group them. And I think a lot of those accounts in the Old Testament, it's kind of how you're grouping them. Where they're numbering the men in Israel, like the army, or I don't remember what was in your example, but sometimes they're numbering the army, and it's like, is this just the normal Israelites and not including, the king's militia? Mm-hmm. Is this the normal Israelites of fighting age, but maybe haven't ever seen combat? Is this just the combat veterans? Is this just the charioteers, or is it including the foot soldiers? And so a lot of the number differences can be resolved if you're kind of looking at how they're grouping it. And there's one example of that is where David basically buys what will become the temple, the threshing floor of Aruna there. And you've got different accounts of different amounts of money. But when you look at it, he's making different purchases. He buys the threshing floor and the oxen, but then he also buys the land, like the site.
Right.
And so when you look at, he's making different purchases with different amounts, there's a logical possibility there that that's what's going on. And I think a lot of those can be resolved that way. And obviously, Haley and some of these different guys, they go into the specifics of what they're counting and what they're counting. Another example would be Solomon's stables. Like, was it 40,000? Was it 4,000? So it depends what you're really grouping or talking about.
Yeah.
Another possibility is there was a copying error.
Yeah.
In fact, if you look at the Jewish numbers, they had a system kind of like the Roman numerals, where they use letters. And some of those numbers, the Hebrew letters, are almost exactly the same.
Right.
And for example, if I said, I don't know, yesterday I rode my bile, B-I-L-E, you would say, no, I rode my bike. You'd figure out that mistake because it's a word, but with numbers, there's no context. And so when you're copying, making a copying error with numbers, so I try to caution people, when you see numbers in the Old Testament, take that with a really big grain of salt, because copying over periods of time, the possibility of making a 5 be a 3, and same thing with spellings of names of kings, Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadrezzar. Not that probably people would make that a contradiction, although I've seen that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
Well, and you're right.
Well, there's no standardized spelling.
Right.
They didn't have standardized spelling. Yeah.
And you're right.
It's a copy. That could be a copying error as well.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And that's typical in a lot of ways throughout the Old Testament. So a good example of that would be 2 Kings 8:26 versus 2 Chronicles 22:2, when it talks about how old was King is it Azam? But was he 42 years old, or was he 22 years old? And so he's actually 22 years old, but there seemed to be a copyist error because the 42 and the 22 look very similar.
Yeah.
But more than likely, it's just a copyist error, either due to a smudge or something that was maybe part of the papyri was messed up, so it was not very clear. But yeah, it's about I think in one book I remember there's about 13 categories of Bible apparent contradictions, and they're pretty easily resolved. But yeah, you're right. Typically, numbers can be easily resolved like that. So
yeah. Although with that one, most people would say it's a copyist error. He was really 22 and not 42.
Yep.
And we have differing manuscripts.
Yeah.
Not all the ancient manuscripts say 42 on that particular scripture. So that seems very plausible. But I read one apologist who said in the Hebrew, it says he was a son of 42 years.
Yeah.
So does that mean he was 42 years old, or does that mean he's part of this 42-year dynasty because his grandfather was King Omri of the house of David, and he had been king of, it was about 42 years when this king took over? Is it talking about that? So logically possible that could be the case too, but I don't have any problem saying it's a copyist error because that's manuscript evidence.
Yeah, and I think it's always important when we're talking about contradictions. We're basically saying that the original, manuscript or what was no contradictions or were, inspired by God. It's not the copies that were, even though our copies are much more accurate, I would say, than probably any other ancient, document. But
Dan, you seem to have the Chicago Statement on Inerrancy kind of in the background behind your discussion. Is that a reasonable thought?
Oh, I think the Chicago Statement is, I don't think it's the last word on inerrancy, but I think it's a good starting point. If you want to start talking about biblical inerrancy and kind of what it is and what it isn't, I think that's a great place to start. We may want to nuance it a little differently, right. But I think they've thought through.
Those have
I think they've thought through a lot of issues.
Perspective than probably you and I do. They were trying to defend that evolution probably is not even true, I think, as they were creating that statement. So, but I find it to be useful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's so many misunderstandings about inerrancy. I think that's kind of a good place to start of what we mean and what we don't mean, and then if you want to go from there and nuance it a little differently, or but I think it's a great start in kind of clarifying.
I'm going to type that in for our students so they'll know what we're talking about. You can
Yeah.
find it anywhere. It's it's got what, about 17, 20 statements, something like that.
Yeah.
So I got to type it in. You guys keep going here while I'm typing.
So, Dan, in your experience talking with different brothers and sisters, I'll sort of reiterate this question. Has there been questions that you tend to get oftentimes from different disciples that you feel like you've had to address, or maybe questions about apparent contradictions that you've had to deal with repeatedly with maybe unbelievers?
I think a lot of these, like you see lists online, you see skeptic books from atheists or Muslims or whatever. A lot of these, even some I covered today, tend to be a little nitpicky, just trying to take pot shots at the Bible. But I think the ones that are most troubling for non-Christians and Christians are the more moral problems, where you see someone lifted up in the scriptures as a good person doing something that seems questionable, or especially when you see God himself seeming to do things that don't seem right or don't seem just. And I think John covered a lot of those last week, where we kind of struggle with the justice of God, or the righteousness of God. And I think those are the most troubling ones. I don't think these little nitpicky ones are really the ones that keep people up at night. Was he going into Jericho, out of Jericho?
I think that, although it's not our place to judge people necessarily, we can kind of look at the heart of the people making the criticism. And at the risk of, when I look at Muslim criticisms of the Bible's reliability, I find myself being very, very skeptical of their motivation. Because they need to undermine the reliability of the Bible in order to even stay a Muslim. Because the Quran makes statements that are clearly historical statements which cannot possibly, because either Jesus was crucified or he wasn't. And if the Bible said he was crucified and that he wasn't crucified, now that would be that's an example of a true contradiction. So I think as disciples are out there reading things, they need to have some training in asking some questions about not that we should judge outright judge somebody and not listen to anything they say, but I think a certain amount of discernment is called for here.
Yeah. That's another look who's talking kind of category.
Yeah. And unfortunately, disciples have often behaved like those people. Christians, people who claim they're Christians, often behave, blow things off and treat other religions unfairly. So we need to be prepared to treat other religions as we would want ours to be treated as well.
Right. And that's something I try to do with Islam, looking at the Quran and the Hadith literature and all the different Muslim sources. I really make an effort to give them the same courtesy, because there are Christian lists of here's all the contradictions in the Quran. And so when I've looked at some of those, it's like, well, that doesn't really seem irresolvable to me. And so I'm really reluctant to just copy and paste some big list of problems with the Quran, or it's like, I want to kind of look at it and, I don't see a lot of those as necessarily that troubling. There are quite a few of them that are significant issues, but some of them seem a little nitpicky, and it's like, well, maybe this is a more figurative passage, or
Right. I try to read the commentary by Muslims on the supposed contradiction, and I think if enemies of Christianity would do the same thing, they could save a lot of people a lot of wasted time.
Yeah, that's true.
Right.
And Dan, what I think for those who are watching, do you have any tips about like how do we go about studying, this issue a lot more, or what books or websites that may be helpful?
As far as engaging other people, just as I said at the beginning, if someone brings something up, it's good to ask, are you just talking about the Bible being confusing, or are you just, where are you coming from on that? And then what's your example of a contradiction? And, let's take a look at it. Are you open to kind of looking at it? And I think we have to educate each other and non-Christians as to what is a logical contradiction.
Yeah. And what about in our own personal Bible study? Sometimes we may read a text, and I know there's kind of the broad category of Bible difficulties, and there's like hard sayings, like the difficult things, which we really cover, which I now understand due to time, and then there's the apparent contradictions. But in our own Bible studies, are there certain materials, books, websites, besides Evidence for Christianity? Obviously, that's a great one. That you point people to?
Commentaries obviously deal with a lot of these issues. As far as on the web, there's a mainstream Churches of Christ website called Apologetics Press that is coming from a young earth creationist perspective, which not everyone is going to share, but they have a large section on alleged Bible contradictions, and you can go through on their website and just look up Old Testament, New Testament, and they give a pretty good treatment on most of the familiar ones that you'll find online and other places, and so they're a good resource for that. There are other websites, obviously, but they're a pretty good one, and other than ours.
Okay. And we do have some questions. I don't know if you guys want to get to those.
Questions. Just wanted to make one comment before we go to the questions, which is that for questions about Islam, Dan and I did a class on Islam. Dan was the main teacher. I was just his backup teacher, honestly. And that's available at the website. But one sort of thing that happened that kind of illustrates what we're talking about is at that class, at the front, we said, folks, we're talking about another religion here, and we're not going to make angry diatribes. We're going to treat them fairly and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And visitors at that event followed our request. But there were a couple of members of our churches, honestly, of our ICOC, who really did not behave well at that talk and had to be asked to speak respectfully. And so I say that to remind ourselves that, the golden rule applies, which is treat other religious groups the way that you'd want to be treated yourself. And then we can engage in useful conversations, even with people we strongly disagree with. And given what's happened in America the last few months, but our country has a long way to go on respectful.
Yeah.
So why don't you lead the way through these comments, Dan?
Sure. So we've had actually a few questions on the same thing. John Marsh and another individual asked about how do you reconcile the death of Judas Iscariot? Was he hanging on the tree above the potter's field when he fell on his body, burst, and his intestines spilled out? So so he's getting into the issue of Matthew 27:5, and in Acts. So on one hand, Judas hangs himself.
Yeah.
But at the other hand, it says that his intestines spilled out. So.
Yeah. Which I covered.
That in my book, Reasons for Belief. It's right on this page right here.
Which page is it?
Page 242 on Reasons for Belief.
Yeah, for those of you
it's impossible.
want to read along.
I do a pretty short chapter in that book, honestly.
Sorry, I have your book elsewhere at the moment. I can't grab it.
But
just email it to me and I'll hold it up. How about that?
Yeah. I think it's I don't think either one disagrees. If someone is hanged from the neck until dead, and they hang there over the Sabbath. Eventually, they're going to fall or they'll be cut down, and their body will have bloated. So I think John might read us a paragraph here.
You virtually quoted from my book, but I'm sure you did because you figured it out on your own. It's not hard to figure out. A body left for 2 or 3 days, the heat that falls from a few feet and hits the ground is likely to burst open. Right, and that's in the nitpicky category. So obviously not contradictory that when people give an example, I find myself thinking, okay. It's a good question, John. By the way, John Marsh, it's a great question. I don't mean to.
Yeah, it's not a bad question.
Right, it's a great question, but to put it out there and say this proves the Bible's contradictory. So John asking that question is a perfect example because it is an apparent contradiction. And so we can either ignore those things or we can simply ask about it.
Yeah.
And remember that, Jewish law, if, Judas is dead, they're not going to touch him for quite some time, or maybe the Roman for the ones who, basically dragged off Judas's body. Interesting, Papias actually writes about that. And he says, let me just put him right here. It says, Judas walked about in worlds, a sad example of impiety, for his body having swollen to such an extent that he could not pass where a chariot could pass easily, he would be crushed by the chariot so that his bowels gushed out. So that's by Papias writing about Judas, just kind of confirming that Papias obviously wasn't like a firsthand reporter, but he had heard that from others. But it just kind of gives you a little bit more insight that, he hung from the tree, his mouth swelled, he, hit the ground, everything burst out, and at some point he was taken away, So
it says it was a chariot that ran over his body.
Yeah.
Which sounds a little bit implausible, but Papias knew people who met Judas. So, because he's early 2nd century. So that's interesting.
And I apologize, you broke it there, John. What were you saying?
What I'm saying is, Papias's explanation at first sounds not quite as plausible, the chariot thing. But on the other hand, Papias, who's in the early 2nd century, he literally knew people who had met Judas. Yeah,
absolutely.
Even if that's not what happened, it's logically possible that's what happened. So.
Yeah. So do we have a couple others, Dan?
We do. One other one is from Todd. He says, how about John 14:14? If you ask for anything in my name, I will do it. Seems like God will do it whatever I ask.
Yeah.
James 4?
Yeah, that would be relevant.
Yeah. And Todd is quoting from John 14:14.
Yeah, James 4. This fits under your generalization thing, Dan, right? So in James 4, it says, let me see. Could it be James 5? I can't remember. If you ask with wrong motives, you won't receive it. Where is that? Here you go. James 4:3, James 4:2. You desire, but you don't have, so you kill. You covet, you do not get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask God. When you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasure. So apparently, we get everything that we ask for, unless, of course, our motives really stink. In which case, why should we think God would give us that?
Yeah. So that's a clarification, and I think most people would look at that and say we have to take everything Scripture says about prayer and not just isolate one verse and see that as kind of the absolute. I want to note as well, Dr. Craig Hazen, the head of the apologetics program at Biola University, has a short book on that passage in John 14. I don't remember the title offhand, but If you look under Craig Hazen, Hazen is the last name. He has a book on prayer he came out with a year or two ago. A nice short treatment on prayer, kind of focusing on that verse.
Here's another verse, 1 John 5, 14 and 15. This is the confidence we have in approaching God, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. And if we know he hears us, whatever we ask, we know that we have it of him. In other words, if it's according to his will. So if we ask for something that goes against his will, he won't give it to us. Except the Bible even gives an exception to that, because Abraham asked something of God that wasn't by his will, and God even changed his will because he asked. So simple answers to this question.
Well, and Jesus teaches us to pray, thy will be done.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have one other one, John Catania. What's up, John? He asked a pretty good question. He says, God rebukes Job's 3 friends, but does not mention the young Elihu in his rebuke. Why is that?
Yeah. I don't think that's a contradiction, but it is an interesting question, though.
It is. Yeah.
It seems like the young guy, maybe did a little better job. Was a little more humble and so that's just off the top of my head. I think that's maybe what's going on there.
I agree.
Yeah, well,
it was closer to the correct view than any of the other, even arguably even than Job's view.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And so if you look at Elihu's friends, they kind of accuse Job of some sort of outward sin, meaning like, hey, you did something and therefore you kind of reap what you sow. Or Elihu is just more of, hey, I'm rebuking you for your self-righteousness. And so if you look at, for example, like Job 32, 1-2, and some other passages within Job, what Elihu talks about is pretty much in line with what God says about Job. And so with Elihu, I think he did get it on point, just in terms of it's Job's self-righteousness that he's rebuking during that stage when he's meeting with his friends. And he has friends weren't very helpful at all about what they were,
Yeah, I think Elihu is more in line with Job than his friend. But, when I study Job, I like to give Job's friends some grace as well.
Right.
Yeah. A long distance. And when they got there, they didn't start rebuking him. They just hung out with him for a long period of time. And then they rebuked him unhelpfully.
Yeah.
But they were there.
They were great comforters until they started talking.
Yeah, there you go.
Sometimes you got to sit down and just shut up. That's right.
Yeah, there's some great grief recovery principles there. Yeah.
There's another question that came, and forgive me if I'm not pronouncing the name correctly. It's from Rima Hin. In John 8:56, Jesus says, Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. How did Abraham see Jesus' day? What does that mean?
I think there's as far as him meeting Jesus, that's an interesting question. Jesus shows up in the Old Testament. In a sense, God is promising Abraham that, through his seed, he will have, all these children like the stars in the heaven. Is that rejoicing to see Jesus' day? Jesus as the seed of Abraham that will produce, all these children of faith. That could be, a possibility.
Yeah.
I don't think these are really logical contradictions, but I think it's an interesting question.
She's bringing up a contradiction. She's asking a question. By the way, I know quite well from visiting with her when she was in the Middle East. She's here in LA now, though, by the way.
Oh, cool. But yeah, whatever you guys.
Her husband
wanna
was
add
leading
on.
the church in Jordan, and unfortunately, he was tragically killed.
Oh, wow.
So,
Yeah, sorry.
I agree with Dan. Basically, basically, God said, all nations will be blessed through you.
Yeah.
And Abraham may not have fully understood exactly precisely what I was anticipating, but it turned out to be true. Through one of his descendants, Jesus Christ, all nations were blessed.
Yeah.
So, like in Hebrews 11, it said these people saw these prophecies from a distance. And basically, the writer of Hebrews says we have them fulfilled right in front of us. So, more reason why we should believe. If Abraham believed, then we should all the more.
Yeah. Yeah. And by day, I think Jesus is just, it's just talking about the fulfillment of redemption. So, yeah you're right. So, great question. And then
this is the wrong hymn. There are two sisters. There are two sisters. Oh, this is so embarrassing. Yes.
So she says, "I live in Jordan." Okay.
Right. Her sister-in-law is one whose husband was killed in the car accident, who was leading the church in Jordan. This is Simon's wife, who Simon was converted in San Diego, and he moved to Jordan and converted his family. And by the time our church was planted in Amman, he was there were several disciples in the church there in Amman, and then we just met them. And so the story of Simon and Rima, and also the other Hin family. My apologies, Rima. That's such a terrible mistake. I so much apologize. But their story is so incredibly inspiring, and yet also, honestly, a little bit sad as well.
Yeah.
But Simon and Rima were leading the church in Cairo when I was there, but they've since moved back to Amman. I believe I'm correct, Rima. You can correct me if you like.
We have one other question to it. It still kind of relates to Judas, but a little bit different. This is from John Marsh. Do you know if there are any prophecies of Judas committing suicide in the Old Testament?
I can't think of one.
Yeah, not that I'm aware of either.
Let me kind of respond to that. See, this goes back to the idea about predestination, because generally God lets people choose what they're going to do, correct? That's called free will.
Yeah.
But history, only a very limited number of times God intervenes. In other words, he basically says, I'm sorry, but you don't get to decide on this. And that was, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Yes? It says that in Romans 9. And I believe God...
This is a good preview for Kedron's talk next week.
And God intervened in Judas' life. But my personal opinion is it was not predestined that Pharaoh would go to hell, or that Judas would go to hell. And so when God intervened in their lives for our salvation, his predestination was not predestination of their ultimate demise, but of something that they did. And Kedron, feel free to add to that, because this is your topic.
Yeah, so I mean, you're right. Like you said, Judas made his own free choice to betray Jesus. God just foreknew that would happen, and God foreknew the outcome. And God's foreknowledge of that doesn't mean that it's determined, but it just means that God just simply foreknew what Judas would do, and then that's kind of it. So, yeah, there's no, oftentimes when we hear the word predestination, we think Calvinism, which has really hijacked that term and really made it a really bad term. But we don't believe in what's sometimes referred to as double predestination, that somehow Judas was, God wanted Judas to go to hell for God's own glory for some odd reason. That's not what happened. Just God foreknew that Judas would make a certain decision, and Judas did, unfortunately. So, yeah.
Well, that seems to
But
be a perfect lead into next week's class.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a fun class. It covers a lot of topics, but we can get to that next week. I don't see any other questions unless people have any other ones. But as we kind of segue, at least for next week, we'll be talking about decision making in the will of God, which is going to kind of tackle and cover multiple things like the knowledge of God, what sovereignty is, what's predestination. We may get into election, kind of depending on that, and what do we mean by God's will? And with all that kind of in mind, how do we make decisions for our own lives? So that's going to be at least a little bit to whet your appetite a little bit there, so that way you can go out and, tackle these issues. So
Kendra, last week for our Bible talk, I did it on election.
Oh, okay.
Because we have our Bible talk on Tuesday night.
Yeah.
I'm talking about not 3 days.
Good topic. Yeah, there's unfortunately a lot of misunderstanding about what election
on election. We had fun with that one.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of misunderstandings about those topics thanks to Calvinism. I'm being sarcastic with that, but I do appreciate you, Dan, and you, John. I think we're really being able to dig deep on these subjects, and it's always fun to be able to talk about these things.
Oh, yeah.
We do have a question coming up. Somebody's going to be typing it up.
All right.
So we'll kind of wait on that, but I'm glad. Is it John? Is it Rima? Am I pronouncing that name right?
It looks like that Rima Hin.
Yeah, is that
Simon's wife, the one who lives in Oman? But the question is from Rayola Osanya, right? Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
You want to read it and have Dan answer it?
Yeah. So it says Exodus 33:11 says the Lord would speak. The Lord would speak to Moses face to face, as one speaks to a friend. But Exodus 33:20 says God says, "You cannot see my face, for no one may see and live."
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good one. When the Old Testament is talking about Moses and God speaking face to face, I guess literally in the Hebrew, they're speaking mouth to mouth. But either way, it's basically they're speaking directly. That's what it means, and that's kind of an idiomatic way of saying they're talking directly, and so that initial passage, Miriam and Aaron have kind of quarreling with Moses. He's taking he's getting a little pretentious with his role in the community, and God intervenes and basically says, I speak to prophets through dreams and visions, kind of these indirect ways, but Moses I speak to face to face, man to man. I communicate to him directly. Who are you to question my, chosen prophet Moses? So that's kind of the context of that. It's not about him visually being face to face with God Almighty. It's just talking about God speaks directly and plainly to Moses in a way that he doesn't with most prophets.
Yeah, I just looked up the Hebrew word. The Hebrew word is panet, and it can mean face, but it can also mean appearance or presence, or in front of, or in the presence of. So it has both a literal meaning and a metaphorical reason. I mean, of course, obviously, God doesn't have a face.
Yeah.
Or
mouth.
God the Father. Yeah.
That's a really good question. That's
Yeah.
That-
And
Yeah,
I think that's sort of an important lesson. Not that this is being done by the questioner necessarily, but oftentimes, and Dan, you alluded to this, that oftentimes we kind of impose our own view or
Yeah.
assumption sometimes in the Bible where it's not actually really there. And so we have to be careful sometimes, or at least ask the question. Think like the questioner did, is what does the Bible mean by something? So sometimes it will use figurative language or Hebrew idiom that we as kind of moderners aren't really familiar with. And sometimes it means that we do have to go back and kind of look at what the Hebrew says. And sometimes terms are used in a figurative way, sometimes in a literal way. And then we have to look at the whole Bible to kind of figure out what is being used here. So, yeah.
Another point I think is that obviously the person who wrote this section of Exodus, who definitely knew what he meant, he doesn't think it's a contradiction. Otherwise, he wouldn't have said both things.
Yeah. That's one thing I noticed in looking at some of these is it's just assumed Jesus doesn't know what he's talking about, or the gospel writer didn't know what they were talking about, or the writer of Hebrews forgot what he wrote, 3 chapters earlier. And maybe that's not the right assumption to go into it with. Maybe we should assume, okay, these are reasonable, writers. There's probably something behind what they're saying, and I need to dig a little deeper to find out what they're communicating, rather than just a surface reading that's just assuming that they're, small-minded, religious bigots that can't remember what they wrote.
Yeah. Yep. But yeah, throughout the whole Testament, there is even the New, but especially in the Old Testament, there's a lot of Hebrew figures of speech that have either been lost in translation, so to speak, or we're just not as familiar with them today, or translators and translation call that may not have been in the best interest of a lot of readers. So.
Yeah, and then in John 1, it says, no one has seen God.
Yeah.
All right. And that, I believe when John said that, he was speaking, I believe he had Exodus 33 in mind, even when he wrote those words. And so he's reflecting on that, I believe. Yeah.
Yep. So we have another question that just came. Thank you for the question. It says, did God lie when he had the prophet Isaiah tell King Hezekiah that he was going to die from his illness in Isaiah 38:1? If not, did God change his mind?
Yeah, I think John touched on this earlier about, I think it was Abraham talking with God and asking for something, and God just granted it, just graciously granted it. So I think that's kind of what's going on here is God's having mercy on King Hezekiah. And he was pretty much informing him that his life was at an end. And Hezekiah, prayed and just begged God for mercy, and God was kind and gracious enough to grant him a few more years. Mm-hmm. So I think God did change his mind on that, which is a controversial view, but I think prayer is real. I think when we go to God with things, I think it's a real interaction. And so I think that's kind of what's going on there. And it's clear in other places where the prophet Jeremiah talks about, if God pronounces judgment on a city and the city repents, then God will relent in judging that city, the way God did with the city of Nineveh and Jonah. So
Jonah 3 verse, let me see, verse 2, 40 more days, and then I will come and destroy the city. And clearly he didn't. Yeah. And when we were young, everything was simple and easy, right? So if the Bible says this will happen, that means this will happen. Well, the fact is, some of the prophecies are God saying to the people, just so you know, this is what's going to happen, and there's nothing they could do to avoid it.
Yeah.
Other things, God says this is what's going to happen, and it could be avoided based on repenting. And sometimes the prophet gives clues that this will happen, but if you repent, it won't. And sometimes the prophet doesn't give clues, and so it's tough sometimes, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very true.
Yeah. These are all really good questions.
Yeah, no, they are.
Yeah, it's
And
good.
hopefully that's helpful
They
for you guys.
His warning, and they repented.
Yeah.
All right, guys.
I think I think we're good.
Yeah.
So no, he did not lie when he said that to Isaiah, to Hezekiah rather.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. These were good questions from an international audience.
Yeah. You want to tackle or maybe our last question here? This is from Exodus 20, chapter 20, verse 4.
Yeah.
You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything.
Yeah.
But then God asked to make 2 statues of 2 angels to be put on the cover of the ark of the covenant.
He also asked Moses to make a figure of
bronze
a snake,
snake.
put it up on a pole.
Yeah.
So the idea then is it's a prohibition on making statues and then worshiping them or making them objects of veneration.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, the Jews tended to take that quite literally, and they didn't make statues basically at all.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very much so. So
I think there is a tension there with they're having to look to the bronze serpent to be healed.
Yeah.
And Jesus kind of does a callback to that of there's a reason why there's that weirdness there of no graven images, and here God is commanded to make an image, and
Right.
so
When I'm lifted up on the pole, I'll draw all men unto me. He says,
Yeah.
It's just like that.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yep.
yeah, types, foreshadows. Maybe somebody could write a book about that for Christians.
yeah, I would love that. Maybe you can do that. It'd be
But
nice.
it's interesting that God made an exception on this image when it was the actual thing. You know, it's in the actual tabernacle, it's the actual mercy seat where God actually dwelt. And there he allowed this, essentially an image, to be in the place where the actual thing was.
Yeah.
I never thought about that. That's a brilliant thing that Rima noticed. But Rima's a very smart woman. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's it, guys.
All right. We'll see you next
Okay.
Saturday at 9 o'clock Pacific time.
Yep. And Dan, like always, thank you very much. Thank you guys for
thank you.
joining in.
Yeah.
Feel free to visit the website, evidenceforchristianity.org. So,
Or IPI
And-
Books, which is
Yeah. Thanks to Paul at IPI Books.
yeah.
great. All right. I'm going to rip off the Band-Aid and I'm going to hit that little red button. See you all next week.
See you guys next week.
All right. Thanks, everybody.